Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Demai, Pedig Dalid Halacha Hey, and God willing, starting today, Pedig Hey Halacha Aleph. We are learning Daf Lamed Tes. We left off on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amud Tanei, Nichnas La'ir, quickly reviewing the first din in the Mishnah, the first din in Halacha Hey, and that is that when a traveler arrives in a city, and he doesn't know who are the kosher establishments, right? Today, you have all these great hashgachas that are renowned. Amachaya, if it has the good hashgacha, you go eat there. You didn't have it then. So the Mishnah gave a leniency that you can approach anyone, even though you don't know that the person that you are approaching is a chaver. So therefore, the presumption is that person is a am ha'aretz. And am ha'aretz is not neman. Says the Mishnah, that if the person that you approach says, that ani eini neman. From me, you can't buy. If you buy from me produce, you'll have to tie the my tidings. But that person says, ish ploini neman. He testifies regarding someone else. And even though the rule is that if you are suspect yourself in a certain area of halacha, you're not trusted to testify regarding someone else, right? Eid echad neman b'yisurin is only if you're trusted. This guy is saying, I'm not a neman. Nevertheless, we believe him when he says, Ish ploini neman. That was the din, the first part of the Mishnah. The Gemara explained, indeed, it's a leniency. Kal hekelu ba'ach senoi. Because when people travel, they travel with the exact amount of money needed and for food, chayin nefesh. And if they're going to have to take more tithings off the food that they purchase, even though it's only trumas ma'aser, but it's also ma'aser sheni, they're going to go hungry. So we were lenient. That is the Mishnah. We're going to begin today by learning a braisa that is more or less speaking about the same scenario. However, what we will have in the beginning of today's sugya is the Gemara's comparison of our topic, the Mishnah and the braisa, to a Mishnah in Bechayos. Now let's review the basic laws of a Bechar. We're speaking about a Bechar Behema Tohira. That means the first male offspring. If the first offspring is male from a cow, sheep, or goat, the Torah says that it's kadosh mirachem. It has to be given to a kohen, and the kohen has to offer it as a korban on the mizbeach. However, if that firstborn animal is blemished, and we have to know the halachis, but halachically blemished, and therefore it's unfit to go on the mizbeach, it then automatically becomes the private property of the kohen, and he can consume it. Therefore, since the kohen benefits personally if the bechar gets blemished, at some point the chachamim took away the trustworthiness of a kohen to testify regarding his bechar that it got blemished naturally, because we suspect that he inflicted the blemish on the bechar that was gifted to him. So you have to ask someone else. And here we're going to have in a braisa, in the Mishnah, we have 3 opinions of Tanoim, exactly who is trusted, who's neman, and we're going to make a correlation between the din of who's neman to testify that a bechar is blemished to our din here in Demai regarding someone who you don't even know whether in certain circumstances they will be neman, even though they say that ani eini neman, yet ish ploini neman. Now, we're going to learn about other cases that we did not learn about in the Mishnah. As an example, what happens if a traveler is coming to town, not like the case of the Mishnah in the beginning of today's sugya, God willing, in the Braisa, where he wants to buy the opposite. Someone comes to town, he's a chaver. He has his own truma that he separated from his produce that he needs to gift to a kohen. There is a rule that you're only allowed to give truma to a kohen that is a chaver, not only neman. A chaver meaning someone who's careful to keep his food in a state of tahara, beginning with himself. He keeps himself in a level of tahara. In other words, a chaver. So you want to give the truma to a kohen. You don't know who's a kohen. You don't know who's a kohen chaver. Similarly, what should you do? When you ask someone, you don't know the someone that you're asking. Could you believe them? Could you not believe them? That will be a inversed similar topic. And finally, the final topic that we will have will be on this first part of the Mishnah is if someone comes to the city again and someone says regarding himself, I am trusted, not like the case of the Mishnah. Behind his back, when he turns away, other people say he's not trusted. They don't say it to his face, and we'll see that that has a lot of halachic significance. And at the end of this chapter, we're going to spend a little bit of time focusing on the second case of the Mishnah. Mishnah there speaks about businessmen, chamarim, that are bringing produce into town. And here the Mishnah has a machlokes tanoim. Here we already have, according to the Tanakama, the Chachamim, a suspicion of collusion, that even if one guy says, I'm not Neman, this donkey driver, oh, if you take from me, you'll have to separate my chaver, he's Neman. So even though in the Reish of the Mishnah, because of a person traveling and entering the city, Kal Kelu by Achnesoy Mepnei Chayin Nefesh, you don't have that by two business people. At least according to the Chachamim, you are choishish to goimlin zeh to collusion, that he's only putting himself down for him to be trusted in your eyes, for you to believe when he says that his friends is good. And in the next city, the friend will do the same to him. Rabbi Yehuda does not even hold of collusion in the case of two business people, and that will be the final topic of this Pedic. And God willing, with time, we will start the new Pedic, the fifth Pedic. The fifth Pedic is going to describe the procedure that you have to do when you have to take off the Demai tithings off a loaf of bread. So what we're speaking about over here is that there was Demai produce, Demai flour, Demai grain, that wasn't tithed as it should have been right away. It was actually made into bread. So now, in addition to the Demai separations, challah, there's also challah. Now, 1 second, doesn't the baker have to separate challah? Challah, we're going to go back to what we learned in the second chapter, that any wholesaler is not obligated. The wholesaler doesn't have to separate the Demai separations. The Demai separations falls on the buyer when he's buying from wholesale. That will be the case of the Mishnah. So we're going to learn both about how exactly do you separate the Demai. We're going to have some details that we never learned yet. It will be exciting. We're going to also learn about now the separation of challah. We're going to already have to mention how a baker separates 1/48th. A balabas separates 1/24th. If you buy bread from a baker, even though you're the one who's separating the challah, since the chiyuv kicked in, was triggered when he mixed the flour and the water, when he made it into dough, and the baker was the one that does it, and a baker has to separate 1/48th. If he didn't, and you, the buyer, will, you also only have to separate 1/48th. That will be the case of the Mishnah. And we will see exactly how it's done with some fantastic dinim that we never spoke out up until now. That is more or less Daf Lamed Tes. And without any further ado, Chevra, again, we're going back to Daf Lamed Ches Amid Beis, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid, a Braisa that's speaking the same case of the Reisha of Halacha Hey. So a person is entering the city, they're hungry, they don't know who are the kosher vendors. You don't have these world-renowned hashgaches. So says the Braisa Tanei, that nichnas le'ir, that if you enter a city, the einoi makir adam, and again to emphasize that when you enter the city, you know one source of sellers in the city, one store, one person that is a chaver, then you don't have the leniency of kal heikelu ba'achsanoi mepnei chayin nefesh, because like we mentioned, eid echad is not neman if the eid echad himself is chashut. And more than that, if you remember the beginning of Masechtas Gittin, right, it's chazik yisura, lo is chazik yisura. When it's chazik yisura, we also don't say eid echad neman. Don't forget, when you buy produce, the presumption is that the person is an Amaretz, because most people were Amaratzim. And Amaretz's produce has to be tithed demai. That's called ischazik esura. There is no nemanos of a eidachot. Nevertheless, we are lenient because you will go hungry. So that's the key, that you enter a city and you don't have an option. Now here, the Braisa adds another scenario, and that is oy shohaya oymed begoyren. That's a whole new case. You're not going into a city. You are going to the granary. We are Hashgacha Pratis. We are learning this in the beginning of Menachem of Tavshin Pei Daled. We are learning now the laws of Maistis, and as we just spoke out, we learned this between and Chamaydev, right? So that obviously the produce has to reach the stage of Oinas Hamaistis, fine. But what triggers the obligation to separate the Trumas Umaistis? The Meiruach. The Meiruach was done in the field. Now, everything we learned until now, Dan, and welcome, that is that the Mai, you only have to separate Trumas Meiser and Meiser Shem. Let me add something important. When you buy produce from the field, from the goyden, from the grain heap, which is where people would sell it from, here we have to be suspect that the seller did not even separate Truma yet. So that's another detail. Okay, because he just did the Meiruach. Now, no one, and Amaretz would never eat produce that did not have Truma Gedola separated from it, because he knows that there's a Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shemayim, which there is. But there's a huge difference between someone eating untithed produce, even untithed from Truma, which no one would do, versus an Amaretz who would sell at the Goydan produce prior to the removing of Truma. That an Amaretz is suspect of. In the city, he already removed the Truma. When you buy the Mai in the city, you never have to be concerned about Truma Gedola. This is a new detail that we never had until now. If you buy produce from an Amaretz, if he's an Amaretz, you don't know anyone. In the Goyden, here we have to also separate Truma Gedola. That's the next case. You come to a Goyden, the Eina Market Adam Sham. Before we turn to the Aflamet Ches, let's read inside. We have time, this Marah folder. This is Gavaldik. Details we never had. Right? The Marah folder is 5 lines. The first line under the Gemara, a lot of information. You have to just be in the flow for 2 or 3 weeks. You'll get it all. So Ir Nakat, the case of the city, which is the case of the Mishnah, says the Marah folder Mishum Maisres. Why is the Braisa adding a case of a Goyden? Because here you have another issue, which is Truma Gedola. Aval Be'ir, like we keep on learning, Leka Mishum Truma Gedola, the Kaimalon. Once a farmer, right, or a middleman will take produce from the Goyden into the city, the first thing they will do is remove Truma Gedola. But if you buy it mamish, like in the factory, you're buying it on the plant in the Goyden, there we also have to be afraid that they didn't even remove Truma Gedola. Second to last line, we keep on saying that an Amaretz will never eat tevel that didn't have Truma Gedola removed. Yeah, he won't eat it. Yes, so these are the 2 cases. So the first case in the Braisa is like the Mishnah. Now we have another layer of a case. Turning to the Aflamites, as we learned in the Mishnah, Harez initial, you can ask to find out. To find out what? To find out if the seller, guys, you want to find out if the seller is a Chavid or if the seller is the Am Ha'aretz. You can ask, who do you have to ask? That's the whole leniency of the Mishnah. You don't have to ask a Chavid. You can not only ask a Chaver, but you can even ask an Am Ha'aretz. Divrei Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Even an Am Ha'aretz can testify about the reliability of others, which is what we learned in the Mishnah. Here with other, even bigger chiddush, even regarding Truma Gedola and regarding the Demai Maisres. However, Rabbi Yomi, now Rabbi is not arguing with the case of the Mishnah. Rabbi will argue in the Braisa with the new case that we did not have in the Mishnah, which is when you buy it in the Goyden. Rabbi Yomi, that if it comes to the suspicion, it's in the closet then. It's in the closet if you're looking for that. It's in the closet. That when you buy it in the Goyden, you also have this additional concern of Truma. Ella lechaver bilvad. In other words, for Truma Gedola, in that little window of a case where we have an issue, maybe the guy did not even remove the Truma, and Amaretz cannot be relied upon, as we'll explain in a moment. Okay, Atkan, the new Braisa. So we have a repetition of the case of the Mishnah. We had this new added, you brought it in the Goyden, and by the Goyden, we have a Machlokas Tanoi. As we spoke out, thank you, madam. As we spoke out in our introduction, we're going to go to a similar case, the case of Bechayres. So you have a firstborn male offspring from a cow, sheep, or a goat. That has to be gifted to a kohen. If it's not blemished, it's also kadosh. The kohen cannot eat it. He has to offer it as a carbon, and he'll eat that parts of the carbon that he could eat. It's chachekal. But if it's blemished, then the kohen owns it as his private property, and he can eat it. So we now, when a kohen comes with a blemish b'char, mid the rabbanon, we are suspect that he inflicted the blemish. Now the question will be, and therefore he has to bring an outside person to testify how it got blemished. Now let's see more details about who is trusted to testify regarding the blemish and who's not trusted, similar to our case of Nemanus. Mamish, that will be the correlation. So says the Gemara, I want you to know that that Asya, the Rabbi, this sheet of Rabbi, that ein nishalin ala truma el lochaver bolvad. We don't do that. That will be consistent with the opinion of Rabbi Meir in Masechta B'chayres, and Uder Rab Shimon ben Gamliel will be consistent with his own opinion, B'shitosai. And now let's quote the Mishnah. We learned to Masechtas B'chayres and Babli, it's Daf Lamed Hey, Kol Hamumin Aru Oyin Lav B'dei Adam, any blemish that could have been inflicted by a man. Well, if a blemish could not have been inflicted by a man, you don't have to have any nemanus. Of course, the kohen gets to eat his bechar because it only could have happened. You have to know all of the types of blemishes. But let's say a blinded eye. Let's say an amputated foreleg. These are blemishes that could have happened in nature. Could have happened in nature. The animal was running about and a thorn got stuck in his eye. Could have happened by a human being inflicting it. So here we are suspect, we're choishish, that maybe the owner, the kohen, inflicted a blemish. So here's the rule. And again, we're going to have over here three opinions. First opinion is that Royin Yisrael Ne'emanim, that a shepherd, if he's not a kohen, Mendel, even if the shepherd is working for this kohen, that's a big chiddush. And the chiddush is, I want to say another thing over here. When we're speaking about the fear of collusion, when we have a fear. If the bechar is blemished, when the bechar is blemished, it's property of a kohen. Well, not only does the kohen get to eat it, not as a carbon, any Yisrael can join him at a stable. So, in other words, there is a place to say, how can you even trust a non-kohen shepherd if it's his shepherd? Like they'll help each other. He'll say, no, it happened naturally. And then the kohen, to pay him back, will invite him for dinner. There is such a possibility, but the Tanakam is not chayish to that. He says that if the testifier, if the witness, if the one who's giving testimony is a non-kohen, is a Yisrael, even if he's the shepherd of the kohen, he's believed. And in contrast, Royin Kohanim, Royin Kohanim means even if this shepherd doesn't own it. You understand? The shepherd is a kohen. The shepherd is the one that's testifying, because who would know what happened out there in nature? Normally it's the shepherd. It's just Dibar HaKosev B'Hoidim. So Royin Kohanim won't be Namanim. In other words, it's very consistent. And why is that, Mendel? We're afraid of collusion. Because this shepherd who's testifying right now might benefit. You helped me once. At another event, I will give you my bechar. Blemished or not blemished. In other words, a kohen who is the potential recipient of any bechar, he chayshinan that he's collusion. Goimlin, he'll do a favor and he'll receive a favor. Okay, that is opinion number one. Very simple. The witness has to be a non-kohen. Nukuda. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Oimer, and now we're going to correlate it to our Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Neman hu al chaveiroi, you're never believed to testify regarding your own. The einoi neman al atzmoi. In other words, you're only suspect. He limits the suspicion. You know when you suspect a kohen? Only regarding his own animal. Nikuda. You can testify regarding someone else. Now, what did we learn in our Mishnah? What does Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel say? In the Braisa, that as long as you're not testifying regarding your own produce, you can testify regarding someone else. Period. Now, Rabbi Meir, and we're going to compare this to Rabbi. Don't forget, Rabbi only argues in the new case of the Braisa by Truma Gedoyla. Rabbi Yoimer Choshud al Hadavar, which is in this case that we're talking about. A kohen is not believed to testify regarding the blemish of his bechar. Whenever you have such a rule, automatically he may never be a judge that's adjudicating a case of, not his case. He cannot be a witness. So now it's very simple. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, right, who says that what? That even though a kohen is suspect regarding his own bechar, he can testify regarding someone else. That's the simple meaning that even for truma, even though the Amma audits in the Goyden, might not have removed it yet, he can testify. That's easy. Rabbi follows Rabbi Meir, who holds that since you, in the case of the blemish, you're suspect to inflict a blemish, you cannot be trusted. Same thing. The Am Ha'aretz, by the Goyden, who's suspect, never to eat Truma Gedolah, never to eat Tevel with Truma Gedolah, but not to separate it and to sell it, can never testify regarding someone else. Now, hold on. I just want to add one thing. What about the Mishnah? The Mishnah is in the city. In the city, that's the difference. In the city, it's Kal Heikelu Ba'achsenoi Mepnei Chaya Nefesh. It's not because of Truma Gedolah versus Truma Smaisa. But the city is the exception. But that's how we began the Gemara. We concluded yesterday, in the beginning of the Gemara on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis. If not for the fact that you are a traveler, no, we don't do that. So that fits. Okay. Now, Amar Rabbi Yoinon, that my pligin, I want to go furthermore. Let's go further into this machlokes in the Braisa. That's only regarding likach. If you want to buy the produce, could you trust the Am Ha'aretz's testimony regarding the seller or not? And we spoke this out in the words of introduction. Now, guys, Dan, what we spoke about here is I'm coming. Let's say you're a chaver, you're traveling. At some point, you bought real tevel. And you separated Truma Gedolah. You have to give it to a kohen. You enter a city, you don't know who's the kohen. Now here the issue isn't only who is a kohen, like in a shul, who's a kohen for an aliyah. It's much worse than that, because I am not allowed to give truma, that's tahor, to a kohen unless I know that that kohen is a chaver. Chaver means that he's careful with the dinim of truma and tara, because if the recipient kohen is not careful, he will be matama the truma. So now you need to have someone who's going to testify for you. What about over there? Not buying, in the case of Lechalek, Af Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is moidem, that you cannot rely on a Am Ha'aretz who's testifying regarding someone else. He's saying, oh, ani eni nemon, but that guy is a kohen who's a chaver. Even Rabban Gamliel is moidem, that you cannot rely. And why not? Why not? So ma bein lechalik ubein likach, says the Gemara. Answers the Gemara, because koil yoytze lechiluk. Because if people are going to see that someone testified regarding who's a kohen chaver, and what are we going to see, Mendel? That guy's testimony will be relied upon. You know what people will think? That if we relied on him, is a raya that he is a chaver. Big difference. Buying is not so serious. When it comes to being machalek, if someone would be believed to say that I'm not a chaver, but that guy is a kohen who's a chaver, if we would allow his testimony to be accepted, onlookers would come to the wrong conclusion that the aide himself is a chaver. Verstehst? And therefore, and other people are going to give him a truma. So therefore, there's never a heter by someone to testify regarding who is a kohen chaver. I want to add another layer over here. There's also something else, and that is there's no kal hekelu ba'achsanoi. If I have truma in my possession, even if I don't have whom to give it to yet, so what? So what? So it's a schlep, so to say, but I will be able to eat. It's not affecting my chaya nefesh at all. Okay, now we're going to learn another brayso, and I know there are various ways of learning it. We're going to follow the interpretation of the Pnei Moshe and others. Anichnas le'ir, when you enter a city, this sounds like the case of the Mishnah. Umatza siyos shel bnei adam. And you find groups of people, and again, here you want to buy. You don't want to have to be. You don't want to tithe the my tithings. And Omar, so you ask the group, Mikan Neman, Mikan Maaser. Just repeating what we learned, I think it was 2 days ago. That Neman means someone who never buys Peiros HaMa'aretz. Maaser means someone who, no matter who they buy it from, they always remove the demai separations. Bottom line is, who's a Neman? The mamish, like the case of the Mishnah, one guy from the group says, not like the case of the Mishnah. The case of the Mishnah was the guy says, Ani eini neman, ploini neman. In this brayso, the guy says, I'm neman. Now, hold on, guys. Would you believe someone who testifies regarding himself? Not so quick. But here he's testifying it in front of other people. In front of other people. That means the other people, if they would not agree with him, they would challenge him. So like this. If they give a gushpanka on what he says, they authenticate what he says, im amruloi, shu neman. The other guy say, yeah, he's taka neman. Tekadez a neman. It works. Right? In other words, his testimony regarding himself is worthless. But like we learned in the Mishnah, that other people testifying for him, even if the other people themselves are amaratzim, we believe them. Here's the chiddush. But if they tell him in his face, you're not Neman. If they tell this traveler, this guy is not Neman, so if they said it b'fanav, taka eina Neman. Okay, because he was, we don't believe him. Other people are saying you're not Neman. Here the chiddush is that if shaloi b'fanav, if in his face they didn't say a peep. After the guy who said, I'm Neman, walked away, others said, he's not Neman. Now, let me ask you a question. Why wouldn't they challenge him in his face? Why did they only say behind his back, he's not Neman? Oh, that's the thing. Shaloi b'fanav, he remains Neman. It's the fact that others did not contradict him in his face. This is a key psychological thing. It gives that person more credibility. Amazing. In other words, their silence, b'fanav, when Reuven says, I'm Neman, buy from me, everyone else's silence means they're saying, yes, you are. When he went away, they said he's not Neman. They're cowards. In other words, what they say behind his back is insignificant. Now, Amar Rabbi Yoina, that when you read the Braisa, he begins by saying you could understand it regarding two scenarios. We can have two different cases, which seemingly the Braisa could apply to, and the Gemara is going to show you that no, it cannot. The Braisa is only going to be referring to one of the two cases. What are the two cases? Amar Rabbi Yoina, number one. Oh, guys, what we're reading now, there are different ways of learning it. We're going to follow the Pnei Moshe, we're going to follow the Gra in the Ksaviyad base in the bottom says the way we're going to learn right now. That Bevenir, the Braisa can be speaking about Bevenir means the buyer is from the city. And Rabbi Mendel, that will make this Braisa different than the Mishnah. The Mishnah is speaking about a traveler. Remember that. A traveler, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that a traveler could rely on the testimony of an Amaretz regarding someone else. To say that this Braisa is speaking about Bevenir, we're going to learn Pshat. Bevenir means that the buyer lives in the city. If you live in the city, there is no leniency for you. So why is it that he can believe someone? Because the group are chavedim. We can learn the Braisa. The Braisa is not speaking about the traveler. The Braisa might be speaking about the asker. The potential buyer is a habitant of the city. Put a comma. If you live in the city, you cannot rely on the testimony of an Amaretz and a Chanan. So when the Braisa began with the words that you enter a city, Umatza Siyois Shal Bnei Adam, the Braisa didn't say that they were Amaratzim. It must be that the Siyois are Chavedim. And that's why Chavedim are allowed to be trusted. That's beautiful. And by the way, there'll be a big chiddush with that. What will be the big chiddush? That if the group of Chavedim behind the back of that individual will say he's not Neman, you don't even believe them. Why not? Because they did not say it b'fanav. Here you see the importance of speaking up and b'fanav. The other way of learning Pshat in the Braisa, Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, will be that the Braisa is speaking like the case of our Mishnah, that who is the one wanting to buy, not a Ben Ir, not a local person, Uba'ach Senoi, Kama, and in that case, who are the group of people that he's asking, even if they are Amaharetz? And then the Braisa will be like the Mishnah with this added layer that even if Shaloi B'fanav they say he's not believed, Fakert, the fact that B'fanav they didn't challenge what he said, I'm Neman. They didn't challenge him. Actually, that means that he's Neman. Okay. Now the Gemara says that I disagree with the option number one. And fine. And that will be fine. And we're going to take account that the Braisa is only option number two. The Kasha al the Rabbi Yoinam. Chavedim. If the case of the Braisa is Chavedim, the At Amrat, and nevertheless, like we said, there will be a big chiddush that if behind the back, right? If behind the back, Shaloi B'fanav, we say that he still remains a Neman, that we don't accept that. Words, if we don't know who they are, then we have the right to interpret the fact that they did not contradict them. The fun of, forget, we don't believe them. But if they are chavedim, even though behind the back of the guy that says I'm a Neman, they say he's not Neman, they should still have Neman. So therefore, we reject the option of applying the Braisa regarding a Ben Ir and the Sioik, the group is chavedim. It must be the group of Amaratzim. If for the group to be Amaratzim, we must be speaking about a traveler. Okay. Okay, now the end of this chapter is going to refer to the second case of Halacha Hey. It's going to refer back to the second case in the Mishnah we had on the Flamet Chesed base. And there we have a Machlokes Tanoim. Maybe we are Chayshinon Legoimlin Ze'ed, we are suspect to collusion. And what is that case? Not a traveler, the opposite, sellers. And the way it would work is that donkey drivers would go to a city where a certain product was cheaper. They would buy it in the cheaper location. As a basic business, they would go to another city where this item is more expensive and they would sell it there. People don't know who these donkey drivers are. So imagine someone comes up with a pop-up restaurant with no hashgacha. What are you going to do? So the case of the Mishnah was that donkey driver number one says, listen, I'm not Neman. My guy is Neman. Says the Mishnah, Tanakama, not Rabbi Yehuda. You don't believe him. Collusion. And then in the next city, the other guy will do the reverse. And Rabbi Yehuda says, even there, he's Neman. So it makes sense that we should be chashin and the collusion. That the Tanakama doesn't have to be explained. Rabbi Yehuda says that even in such a case, since he's not testifying regarding himself, we believe his testimony regarding his friend. Here, you don't have the kala kelu ba'achsanoi. Why eidach haneman be eidach haneman? It's chazik yisura. The guy is not trustworthy. If you're chashad l'davar echad, you should not be neman, even when there's no chazik yisura. So my time at Rabbi Yehuda, l'chayra there should be collusion. So answers the Gemara explains the Gemara. Just like we had up until now, the leniency that a traveler is someone who we have to be careful to make sure he doesn't run out of money/food. He'll go hungry. The same thing is a worry that we have to have for people that live in a city. When you live in a city, supply of product is extremely important. What happens when there's a diminution of a supply of a product? What happens? I don't know, the prices go up. And even more, sometimes you won't have it. So here also, the way it worked then is that today you have Amazon with putting a plug-in, give me a discount, please. Today it's easy to buy from anywhere. It didn't work that way. Today, many cities, economies relied on these chamarim that would bring a product. If you won't be able to rely on their testimony, then you're going to run out of product. So also, it's a leniency because of Chayein Shel B'nei Ha'ir. Now, even here, make it clear, like in the Mishnah, no one is believed to testify regarding themselves. I want you to know this is already the skeleton or the root of having mashgichim. In other words, I cannot testify regarding myself. If you own a store, even though you would be a perfectly kosher mashgiach in my store, but you cannot testify regarding your own store. No one is naman for themselves. Okay, but the guy is saying, my product is not good. My friend's product is good. For the benefit of the townspeople, we also have to be lenient. Hold on. And that's a good logic. And if you use that for the benefit of an individual, should you not for sure use it for the benefit of the city? So my kameyim derabanan that argue and hold that in the case of vendors, we are suspect to collusion. So they say, don't make it such a big thing that if you don't trust these chamarim, you're going to run out of food. Because the way it would work is that many cities had their own supply. They had someone who lived there, that he would be the businessman. He would buy it from China and bring it here. Go to a nearby city. It's not like, if you can't rely on traveling businessmen, you're going to run out of food. The Chachamim hold in other words, that's the way it worked. If this town was so little that you didn't have a local businessman that bought wholesale, sold at retail, so you relied on these traveling business people, the neighboring city would have someone who's established. We're not beginning civilization at this point. We're already a couple of thousand years into it. So it's not as serious as the concern on the traveler who will run out of money, run out of food. When it comes to a city, especially where Americans were living in a so-called free society, at least business-wise, up until some point before taxes, that no, there's already established people. People do business. So if you're not going to have a vendor here, there'll be a vendor in the next city. People are not going to run out of food. There's less of a concern, and therefore we're not lenient. And if you don't know who the witness is, you cannot rely on him. And on this we say, guys, it's interesting that the 5th chapter is also halakeyach. So halakeyach, just to differentiate, the 4th chapter has halakeyach min pedis, and the 5th chapter will be halakeyach min nachtoin, which will be the chapter that we are starting. And let's begin to learn the Mishnah. And then just to repeat a few words of introduction for the people that said brachas with a lot of kavanah. And that is like this. Ideal. When you buy demai produce, okay, demai produce means, Daniel, yeah? When you buy grain from someone who we don't know that person separates all of the tithings, which has to be done when product grows in Israel. So we learned until now that the purchaser could rely that some were removed. Some of these tithings are only a financial question. Whenever there's a financial debate, I always get to keep what's mine. I don't have to give it to you. Bottom line is that the purchaser has to remove 1% as Trumas Meiser, and then he has to remove another 10% as Meiser Sheni. Something unique about Meiser Sheni, that Meiser Sheni really doesn't have to be physically removed. Meiser Sheni only has to be verbally designated. And then after you say, for example, that in this basket, that which is on the top right, you say that which is in the northern part of my basket, 10% of it is Meiser Sheni, you can make another statement, and that Meiser Sheni is redeemed on money. And the money becomes imbued with Meiser Sheni restrictions and holiness, and that may be eaten. So Meiser Sheni actually, de facto, was barely ever removed. But what do you have to remove? You have to remove Trumas Meiser. Another detail about Trumas Meiser. We keep on mentioning that Meiser Sheni doesn't have to be given to the Levi. I know that. But you cannot remove Trumas Meiser directly from produce because that's not the way it works. Trumas Meiser is a separation that is removed from the Meiser Rishon separation. So whenever you remove Trumas Meiser, you have to designate Meiser Rishon. From the designated Meiser Rishon, you actually remove from it 10% of the 10%, which is really 1% of the whole pekel, and that has to be removed. So when you buy the mai, what will you be removing? 1%. But the way you will be doing it is by designating 10% for Meiser Rishon. From the 10%, you designate from it 10% for Trumas Meiser, and you remove it. Now, our Mishnah is speaking about someone who bought bread from a baker. Why are we speaking about buying bread from a baker? Because whenever you bake bread, from when you mix the flour with the water, there is another separation that has to be done, and that's called challah. Nowadays, challah is only midrabanan, which is why there isn't a minimum amount of how much challah is removed. And by the way, we remove it and we burn it. There isn't a shear. Ask your wife, or when you do it. But whenever the obligation of separating challah is biblical, there is a minimum amount. And that will depend whether you're a baker, whether you are an individual. An individual has to remove 1 from 24. A baker has to remove 1 from 48. Now, let me go another step. What happens if you, the baker, did not remove it? I'm a private citizen. I'm a balabas, and I bought it from the baker. I have to remove challah. How much do I remove? 1/24 or 1/48? The rule is only 1/48. If the baker was the one who baked the bread, that means the obligation of challah was enacted, was triggered while it was under the ownership of the baker. So the chiyuv of challah was 1/48. If the baker didn't remove it, when I buy it, it doesn't double in size. You got it? So the case of the Mishnah will be if someone is buying a loaf of bread, halakeyach min anachto. So now what has to be separated, guys, really? Trumas Meiser. But really we said for Trumas Meiser to be separated, you have to designate Meiser Rishon. But you only have to now from it remove Trumas Meiser, and you have to separate challah. What is the way what's the procedure? And you also have to deal with the Meiser Sheni. So the Mishnah is going to be, this is a practical application of all of the dinim we have been learning with the addition of challah. How is it done?
Which one comes first?
Which one comes first, and what do you say exactly? This is the formula of how you were to remove the demai issue, resolve the demai and the challah when you buy bread from a baker. Now, is the baker an am ha'aretz? Is the baker a chaver? We're not going to touch this yet. Okay, let's not add. Let's just go step by step.
Obviously, I'm hard.
Nothing is obvious. That will be a topic in the Gemara. It's not so obvious.
How would you remove it?
Okay, so I shouldn't have even said. You bought bread from a baker. What's the first thing that you have to do? What's the first thing? I want to add one final thing that we didn't speak out yet. When I spoke about designation, which is good enough, there is designation, and then there is the actual marking in the bread. A skeleton of marking in the bread is something that we do nowadays. Do you know that? When you make, what happens when you make a blessing during Shabbos? How do we do that? First of all, there's Lechem Mishnah. Second of all, during the week, there is a rule. We don't want to make an interruption. This is a whole different topic. I don't want to make a hefsek between the blessing and the eating. We're not allowed to bite into bread. I know when people eat sandwiches, that's in America. That's something that is in the halachic ethics not okay. We're supposed to break it in our hands, and when you put it in your mouth, you're putting in your mouth the piece that will fully go into your mouth. I just want you to know that. So therefore, during the week, I cut the bread, I make the bracha, and I eat it, right? So I made the bracha, it's already ready to be put in my mouth, and I put it in my mouth. Shabbos, you can't do that. Why not? Like a Mishnah. You want to make the blessing on whole loaves of bread, not on two. But you want to minimize the amount of time that you spend between the blessing and the eating. So what do people do nowadays? You know that little mark? They make a mark. They don't mark it enough for you to take away the advantage of the shlema. Right? You don't remove anything, but you make, you know what I'm talking about. You make a little mark in the bread. And you have to know also that we do it on the one on the right, and then I'll pick Kabbalah Friday night, you put one on top of the other, Shabbos day you put one on the side of the other, all the whole spiel, not in a negative way. There's a whole, do it like this, do it like that, just a mark. We're learning about a mark now for a different context. Now you'll see a more important mark. What's the mark? Look at this. Noitel, the guys, noitel, I want you to know what it means. Noitel means to mark. Literally, noitel means to take. In this mission, you mark. What do you mark? What will you have to remove at the end? What we just spoke out in our words of introduction. You have to remove, guys, the 1% for Trumas Meiser, and then from what remains, 1/48. 1/48, right? 150 is 2%. Right? 1/48 is a little bit more than 2%. So you are going to be removing at the end how much? A little bit more than 3%. That which you will actually remove prior to the removal, you mark. Not enough to verbally designate. You have to actually mark. So you are marking your noitel. You're going to make a mark on your loaf of bread. How much on one side of the mark will be 96.5%, 96, and on the mark will be marking off a little bit more than 3%. Now, before you remove it, you have to make a declaration, but you mark it first. First, you mark that which will be for Trumas Meiser, which is only 1%. And then, after you remove the 1% from the remaining, it's 1/48, which is going to be the Chal. What do you have to deal with first? Trumas Meiser. To take off Trumas Meiser, you can't just take off 1% and say it's Trumas Meiser. Why not? Because you have to designate Meiser edition. But you didn't mark the Meiser edition. Doesn't matter. But you have to designate the Meiser edition. So how do you designate the Meiser edition? You speak about, I marked off 3 and a bit percent then. Forget about the 2 and a bit. Just focus on the 1. I'm going to mark off 3 and a point, and then I'm going to speak about the 1. I'm going to say that there is 1 in the marked area. Adjacent to the 1, how much more adjacent to the 1 is a Meiser edition? If Trumas Meiser is 1 of 100, no, 9 of 100. Because before you separate Trumas Meiser, you separate 10 of 100. 10%. But 1 is already in the mark. I want to just verbally say that this 1 that's in the mark and another 9 is the Ma'aser addition from which I'm taking off this one. You have to word it that way. You made a mark of 3+%. You want to clearly say you're not speaking about the 2 plus a drop. You're only speaking about the 1. The 1% that's in the marked area, and that will be the Trumas Ma'aser. But before I do the Trumas Ma'aser, I have to speak about the Ma'aser addition. You got it? So adjacent to this 1%, there is another 9. You got it? Another 9% near it, which makes a total of 10%. So now that you designated the Ma'aser Rishon, now you have the Trumas Ma'aser. Zeh she'osisi Ma'aser, the 1% in the marked area. Now that I spoke about the 10%, which is the 1 and the 9, also Trumas Ma'aser Olav. You have to say this like this. So now you resolve the Trumas Ma'aser. What's the next step? Chala. So now you say Bahasha'ar, the remaining in the marked off area. The remaining in the marked off area is Chala. Now what do? Now you break that off. Now the beauty is, to whom do you give Chala? To a kohen. Who do you give Trumas Ma'aser to? To a kohen. So even though when you speak about it, which is the Iker, you speak about it in stages, but you began by making a mark. Now that you made all these proper designations, now you actually remove. Now what comes next? Ma'aser Sheni. From Ma'aser Sheni, you don't even have to make a mark. From Ma'aser Sheni, it's just a designation. And what do you say? Ma'aser Sheni, you have to say where it is. It's going to be in the northern part of the container, or it's going to be in the southern part of the container. And you don't have to separate it. You don't even have to mark it exact. It's only 10, but you know the value of it because you bought it. And by the way, if you remember, we learned that you don't add a fifth when you redeem Ma'aser Sheni of the Mai. There's no din of a fifth. So you know you bought this pekel for how much money? You know how much the percent cost. 10% of what remained, it will be $10. So after you make the verbal designation, then you make the chilul on the mois, and now you can go ahead and eat your bread. After you wash and after you make the other brachas and all the other stuff. Yes.
10% of 96.5%.
10% of 96 and 3/4.
Cut off the bread, you give it to the Kohen?
Yes, you give it to the Kohen. Yes, that.
Just get a little shirayim.
Don't say that. Don't make it way in it. Because if everyone in this room would give the little bit of shirayim,